Hi friends, in this video I'm going to show you wrist CARs, controlled articulations of the wrist. The wrist are super important pieces, especially if you're using your hands a lot in your asana practice or whatever you're doing. Could be Pilates, could be anything. If you're doing planks, if you're doing tabletop position, if you're doing downward dog, these little joints, these little structures are the ones that give us permission to do that, if you will. But we always focus on the biceps, the pecs, and this upper body strength. But these little guys give us the initial permission to do the push and to do the pull. So what we're doing in a wrist CAR is making sure that these muscles control the hand and the wrist and the fingers just as they should in an active manner. In tabletop position, pretend this is the floor and this is my tabletop arm, we're holding ourselves into wrist extension because the floor is putting us or helping us be in that position. But then if you were to do your own wrist extension, do you really have about 90-ish degrees of wrist extension, or are you just about here? And if this is the range of motion that you have, then maybe you position your shoulder a little further away from your wrist when you're in tabletop position. And no one dies. I promise, no one dies if you move your shoulders a little further back. It'll be great. But how do we increase the range of motion then so that we can have better wrist extension? Wrist CARs. We're going to articulate our wrists, and this is what you should be doing before your teacher starts class, you know, warming up your wrist. This is what we're going to do. For wrist CARs, we want to make sure that there's no movement at the forearm or at the elbow joint. So I'm using my hand here to stabilize. Or you can just place your forearm over your knee or thigh or on a different structure like the edge of a table. We start off with left and right movement, otherwise known as ulnar deviation and radial deviation. Radial deviation is when we move the hand in the direction of the thumb because the bone, the arm bone that is closest to the thumb, that is the radius. And ulnar deviation is when we move the hand in the direction of the pinky because the arm bone closest to the pinky side is the ulna. So that's ulnar deviation. You might notice that there is smaller range of motion in the radial deviation when we move towards the thumb, and there's more movement or more range of motion in the ulnar deviation when we move towards the pinky. Please remember that your range of motion is going to be completely different from mine. Maybe not totally different, but a little different. And here we move next into wrist extension and flexion. When we move the palm in the direction of the ventral forearm, or what I would call the part of your forearm with less hair on it, that's wrist flexion. And then when we move the back of the hand towards the dorsal side of the forearm, at least for me, the hairiest part of my forearm, that is wrist extension. And I'm going to place my hands, my fingers, on the back of my hand just to remind you that there is still work being done here. So the back of my hand is looking for my fingers, kind of like an isometric engagement, making sure that I find the end range of my motion, as long as there is no pain there. When I move into flexion, this is actually the wrist that I fractured in 2018, so I have more wrist flexion in my right arm, the hand that I'm not using. What I want to make sure that we're not doing when we move into wrist flexion, the tendency is for people to start curling their fingers like this. Don't do that. Keep your knuckles nice and straight. Keep your fingers straight because you're taking the work then away from the forearm muscles. So let's not do that. So now let's tie all of those movements together to perform a controlled articular rotation of the wrist. I'll begin with ulnar deviation, but while I keep the work of ulnar deviation, I then begin to move into wrist extension. While I keep the work of the wrist extension, I begin to move into radial deviation. I keep the work of the radial deviation as I move into wrist flexion, making sure that I avoid cupping my hand or curling my fingers. I keep the work of the wrist flexion as I move into ulnar deviation. I maintain the work of that ulnar deviation as I move into wrist extension. I keep the work of the wrist extension as I find radial deviation. Again, I keep the radial deviation as I move into wrist flexion. As I begin to move in the opposite direction, I'll move into radial deviation. As I keep the work of radial deviation, I move into wrist extension. I keep the wrist extension as I move into ulnar deviation and move through the ulnar deviation up into wrist flexion. I want to make sure that my forearm is not rotating. So as you can see here, there's very little movement in my forearm. No pronation or supination at the forearm, and also no bending at the elbow, right? You can, of course, do wrist CARs with your elbows straight, but if I'm going to keep an angle at my elbow, I'm going to make sure that that elbow does not move anymore. Only the wrist is moving. That means that my muscles are engaged and they're squeezing and working isometrically to make sure that nothing moves but the wrist. Now I'm going to move into some finger articulations. So just getting the knuckles to articulate as well, moving them into a fist from wrist extension down to flexion. I also call this the vroom vroom movement because, you know, vroom vroom on a motorcycle. Anyway, these are some additional articulations, and I mean not additional. A wrist CAR is when we articulate the wrist, but something that I would add on if you are looking to love your hands and make sure that we articulate all of the little joints in the hands. Getting the fingers to articulate nice and in control will be very important as well. Enjoy your wrist CARs. Let me know if you have any questions, and thanks for watching.